Hi, I'm Patrick Pacheco for Artinfo.com, and welcome to the launch of our show of shows called Play by Play. Sometimes words just aren't enough to capture how smart, funny, and crazy the theater world can be. And so here we are at Chez Josephine on Theater Row, where from time to time we'll introduce you to some of those smart, funny, and crazy artists. Joining me on a regular basis will be my friend and colleague from New York One on stage, Frank DiLella.
Hello, Patrick.
Hi, Frank. How are you?
Good. How are you?
And to get us started is Eva Price, a young and dynamic producer who is on Artinfo's Top 25 Under 35, which is our list of the young and dynamic people who are changing the theater.
Thank you.
Eva, you're represented this season with the revival of Annie and the concerts of Frankie Valli and Louis Black. And we'll get to those shows later, but first, Eva, Frank, Rebecca.
Rebecca.
What were they thinking?
What were they
As
thinking?
my grandmother says, oi.
Well, Patrick, as you know, Rebecca has been all the talk lately on Broadway. The show was supposed to open on Broadway in April of 2012. Well, in January of, earlier this year, they announced they did not have the money. And in the summer, they announced that it was going to open finally in November. Well, the most recent story with this show is that, Ben Sprecher, one of the lead producers on the show, brought in this other guy named Mark Houghton, and he had 4 investors tied to him, and well, guess what? None of them exist.
The ghost investors.
Paul Abrams being the first who died of malaria in London, apparently, but no obituary, nothing.
Right.
So nothing on this guy. So, Rebecca is now not happening.
It's a show about a ghost, so ghost investors make sense, right?
It's one of those stories that Broadway just loves, right? Max Bialystock always be sure and get the checkie.
Yeah.
Be sure and get the checkie. So as
right.
someone who gets the checkies, how did Ben Sprecher end up in this position? Do you know of any situation where a producer knows that he's got a $12 million show and he guts a theater and starts rehearsals with only $8 million?
Set is built. Actors are booked. Everything's done.
Let me make clear that I am not affiliated with the show Rebecca.
Eva is not affiliated
and
with
I
Rebecca.
have great respect for all my colleagues in this business, and I have great sentiment and empathy for what the team of Rebecca is going through, because I can picture it. I can get it. I've never experienced it, and I never plan to. But I can get it. A friend of mine once called me, and what we do, we producers, emotional entrepreneurs, because it's true. We are business people by default, right? We're raising money, we're building a company, we're hiring staff, and we have a bottom line. But we are doing it based on something in here and not necessarily something up here.
Right.
It's very emotional, it's very passionate. And when you get to a place when you're putting together all the wheels and getting them all moving on a production, you have to begin to think, well, the money will come. It just will. I have partners I trust. I have investors I trust. I've done it 100 times before. It will happen, because I have to worry about the casting and the marketing and the advertising and the contracts. And I can't actually worry down to the final I and the final T being crossed of every dollar. But you actually do. At the end of the day, you want to not have to worry about all that, but you actually do. Because at the bottom line of what you do as a producer is finance the show. So I say all that to say I can't believe it happened. It's shocking. But I kind of can see where the emotional entrepreneur within the producer said, it'll come. I trust it's there.
Build it and they will come. Are there any legal rules that govern these sorts of things? Is there any laws that say you have to have this much of your investment, or
I don't know what their papers look like. So all different operating agreements are written differently. The standard is that you have a minimum capitalization that you have to raise before X date, which is generally first public performance, and you have a maximum capitalization that you're allowed to raise by first public performance. Sometimes it's opening, but you can keep raising that money from when rehearsal starts, from when sets are being built. Yeah, there's no rule on that.
And I want to ask you, Eva, gone are the days where you have, one producer putting up a show, a Harold Prince, a David Merrick, if you will.
Yeah.
Nowadays on Broadway, you have 5, 6, 7 producers on a show, but then they are tied to investors.
That's right.
So this Mark guy who had these 4 investors that did not exist, this was the missing piece of Rebecca.
Right.
What do you look for when you're when you're looking for partnering producers? And also, do you go through the list of investors? Do you check up on all these folks?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And you're right. Those days are gone. And desperate times call for desperate measures. And, you have someone who comes to you and says, I'm a businessman, I dress well, I live on Long Island, I have access to money, I've done this before. You think, oh, okay, that makes sense.
Right.
You asked what I do. I work with people I've worked with before. So I don't put myself in a position where I could be disappointed. I know that when I bring on a producing partner or a co-producer on a show, that they've come through already in the past. And if I haven't worked with them before, I know full well that they've come through for other lead producers.
One of the wrinkles of this particular story is that this Mark Houghton was a Long Island businessman, was working on a commission.
Right.
For the money he was bringing in. Have you ever heard of such a thing?
Not
Does that
for
exist?
For commercial Broadway shows, I've never heard of it. That does exist in the nonprofit world. Often people who are raising money for capital campaigns for new buildings or even for nonprofit documentaries or films and things like that, I have heard that, where they get a percentage commission. It's still based on what they bring in, but it's a percentage of what they bring in, and it's a flat commission. We know that the theater business doesn't work that way. There's no commission. There's no line in the budget for this guy raised $1 million and out comes $100,000 to pay Mark Houghton. I've never seen it as a line item. But anything's possible. I mean, side deals are side deals, and lawyers write them up based on what their lead producers tell them, as long as it's within the law.
This set we know was very elaborate. The staircase went on fire. I mean, and the set was built. They started loading in that set, and then the next day they loaded it out.
Yeah,
so,
that's right. Well, that's because there's so much more money put to other things than just the physical production that gets built. Right. All the bonds, all the house costs for load-in and tech. I mean, that alone is millions of dollars.
Yeah. Before we wrap up, we have to talk about the revival of Annie and your shows with Frankie Valli and Louis Beck.
Yeah.
Annie, when I interviewed Tom Meehan for Artinfo.com, he said that Annie was really written as an adult show, that it was written by 3 disaffected liberal Democrats in 1972 after the re-election of Richard Nixon, and that it just happened to become a children's show after that.
Yeah.
Choosing James Lapine to direct this revival, which has not been done before, is that what you were sort of going for? Yeah,
I mean, Annie is truly a classic American Broadway musical, right? It won 7 Tony Awards in 1976. Best score, book, lyrics. I mean, everything that has to do with things adults appreciate. So with that in mind, and you're right, it definitely veered into the world of family, but I think that's because of the stock and amateur licensing that happened. That's because schools and camps and community centers were able to do it. It sort of became that. The Heart of Annie is a classic Broadway musical, one of the best of all time. And so that was the idea behind James Lapine and making sure that the tenets of its basics, we're back to basics of how good the show can be and how much adults appreciate it. That became a focus of this production.
I also thought it was interesting, you guys as producers decided not to go with a star for Miss Hannigan. You chose a theater vet, 2-time Tony Award winner Katie Finneran.
Right.
And then also, Anthony Warlow, who is this big Australian star to come in as Daddy Warbucks. Clark Thorell, Jaylen Marcus. I mean, these are all names we know on Broadway.
Right.
But the average person walking down Broadway to buy a ticket for Annie won't recognize these names.
Yeah.
I mean, talk about your why you cast these folks.
Yeah. I mean, unlike some new shows that are untested and need quote unquote insurance policies, they bring on stars. Annie doesn't need that. The star of Annie is in the title, Annie.
It's a good segue into quickly just talking about Frankie Valli and Louis Black. Did they come to you? Did you come to them? Is it part of a bigger program?
Yeah, I appreciate you asking that. both are stars of the stage in their various ways on tour, and both had desires to play Broadway, and my partners and I had desires to bring them to Broadway. So with Frankie Valli, that was sort of a natural fit. The Broadway audience loves him. He loves this stage. He's been on tour for 50 years, and he's never played Broadway. So that was the reason behind that. And you know, Louis, it's political season. We're a few weeks out from the election, and he has a lot to say. And where better to say it than on a Broadway stage?
Great. Thank you, Eva. Thank you, Frank. I think that was a pretty good launch to Play by Play. Thank you for joining us. I hope you will join us next time. And meanwhile, you can read Play by Play at artinfo.com.